Today, the people of Bougainville will start voting in a referendum almost 20 years in the making. It's to decide whether to split from Papua New Guinea and pursue independence.
The referendum comes 2 decades after the Bougainville peace agreement brought an end to a devastating period of civil war. But the poll is just the first step. For more on this, we're joined now by Dr. Tess Newton-Cain, who's an Adjunct Associate Professor at the Griffith Asia Insitute. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. This vote, as we said, has been many years in the making. Could you give us a brief outline of what's led up to this vote taking place?
You're right, it has been a long time coming. In fact, the initial starting of this process dates back even further than the 20-year period that you've referenced. It dates back to 1969, when the leaders of Bougainville sought a referendum as to whether they wanted to become part of an independent Papua New Guinea as Australia was preparing to give that country its independence. And they were denied that opportunity at that time. And so when the civil war started, or when the conflict started around the Panguna Mine, it very quickly became an issue of self-determination for the people of Bougainville. And that was the war that, as you say, concluded 20 years ago. And since then, under the terms of the Bougainville Peace Agreement, Bougainville and Papua New Guinea and everyone that's worked in and around there has been working towards what started today, which was the referendum on whether Bougainville becomes the newest country in the world or whether it remains within Papua New Guinea but with a greater degree of autonomy than it currently has.
You mentioned the Panguna Mine. A lot of the tension centred around that mine at the time. What were the key grievances at that time?
Well, I think the main issue was that the mine was at its peak. It was one of the biggest mines in the world, and it was making a huge contribution to the overall GDP of Papua New Guinea. But the local people on Bougainville, including the landowners, felt that they weren't getting sufficient recompense or sufficient share of the profits and the benefits of that mine, and that included funding returned to Bougainville, but also opportunities for employment. They felt that there was too much employment of foreigners, and including in that, they meant people from mainland Papua New Guinea.
So turning to today, where this voting process is due to begin, it's expected to be overwhelmingly in favour of independence. But is the result of the vote binding?
No, so voting's underway. The voting commenced at 8 o'clock local time this morning. And as you're quite right to raise that point of the binding nature. So it's not a binding referendum. Whatever the result, and we won't know that for a while yet, the voting period lasts for 2 weeks. Whatever the result, there then needs to be a period of negotiation between the autonomous government in Bougainville and the Papua New Guinea national government, and they will then put the results of that negotiation to the Papua New Guinea Parliament, and under the terms of the peace agreement, it's the Papua New Guinea Parliament that has to sign off on whatever happens next.
So given what we know about the history of the relationship between Papua New Guinea and Bougainville, what do you think those negotiations will look like after we know the result of this vote?
Well, it largely comes down to what the result is. If, as expected, the result is overwhelmingly in favour of independence, then that means that the negotiations we would expect would be looking at how independence is going to come about, what sort of transition arrangements need to be put in place, and hopefully some clarity as to how long a transition period it would take for Bougainville to be able to be established as an independent state. As I said, it is up to the Parliament of Papua New Guinea, and obviously there are a range of views at play within the Parliament. Some people feel that whatever the result is, it should be accepted. Other people are quite resistant to the idea of Bougainville separating from Papua New Guinea. So that period of negotiation is going to be crucial. In
your opinion, is Bougainville ready for independence?
I think it depends what you mean by ready. So there's been a significant lack of investment in human capital development. So there are severe shortages in terms of things like health servicing and education services. So the war basically led to an entire generation missing out on key schooling, and Bougainville has been, making amends for that, or making up for that ever since. So there is a deficit when it comes to capacity, but I think it's really important that this is a vote for people that really want to stamp their their future with their relationship with the land that they've occupied for thousands and thousands of years. Bougainvillian people are an independent, spirited people, and so I think, you know, we all need to be prepared to support them in whatever decision they make for themselves.
There have been tensions around influence in the Pacific region, particularly with America, with China and with Australia. Do you think those nations will be watching this result closely, and why?
Well, I think all nations should be watching this result closely. If we're going to have a new country in the world and in our region, then I think it's important that we learn more about that potential country and the people that live there. But certainly, given all that we know about current geostrategic tensions that are at play in our region, there definitely are going to be closely guarded or closely watched. The results of this are going to be very closely watched by people in Canberra and Washington. And obviously, as we know, China is a rising power in the world in general and in the Pacific more generally. So I think it's to be expected that if Bougainville is moving towards becoming an independent country, one of the issues that they're going to be looking at is how they form relationships with other countries, including those closest to them and those that are maybe a bit further away.
Looking at the peace agreement more broadly, are there lessons for other nations to learn looking at Bougainville's path towards independence, if that's where this results?
So this peace agreement has been in place for quite some time, and Bertie Ahern, who is the chair of the Referendum Commission, wrote a piece earlier in the week in which he said, you know, it's quite common for peace agreements to not be as successful as this one, to just not last, to not be able to be sustained. So there's been a lot of work that's gone into keeping this peace agreement in place and keeping everyone committed to it. Now, that hasn't been a singularly smooth process. There have certainly been bumps along the way. But what we've seen in the last year or so is some real commitment on the part of communities to really get this process to the conclusion that started today, which is in order to be able to have a referendum in an environment where people feel safe and secure and able to exercise their vote according to the wishes that they have for themselves and their families and their communities.
Dr. Tess Newton-Cain, we really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Joanna.